have to ask the intention of who's consuming the narrative. Is there a need for a new narrative? I'm like, I don't trust anyone to tell a new narrative. Like, who's gonna tell it?
Because you also acknowledge that not everyone is protected by that, even if some are. That is part of the narrative. That's part of the narrative that many of us are struggling to address. It's not enough to say, did it help some? It's, is it enough for the whole?
The call, rather, or the need is protection within society.
It has not stopped us from having disproportionately more queer youth of color, in particular, in foster care.
Why does it require narratives of harm for others to empathize?
Because you also acknowledge that not everyone is protected by that, even if some are.
And how does democracy thrive on that appetite? Giving me hope, because we could see how to think through these issues without flattening them out. Welcome to our intergenerational conversation hosted by the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department at Wake Forest University. I am Julia Jordan-Zachery, the chair of the department, and for this, our second annual intergenerational conversation, I will also serve as host. Before we get going and allow our esteemed guests to introduce themselves, I first need to thank Ms. Sarah Goldstein for all of her organizational skills, for putting together the webinar, and all of the background work that she does. As is my custom, before we get going, I ask us to pause for a moment and to recognize the ancestors with a moment of silence. And for this particular moment, I honor my grandmother, Kathleen Griffith, who recently became an ancestor. So if we can, lower your lids or close your eyes, and we'll just take a quick moment. After that, our guests will introduce themselves for the evening. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you both, Chris and Bianca. What a pleasure to have this conversation on LGBTQ plus youth of color and just LGBTQ plus issues in general, particularly if anyone is paying attention to the news. It feels like a constant barrage against this population. And so we host these intergenerational conversations as a way of bringing scholars and young folk together to just, as the young folk would say, Chris, correct me, I don't know if this is still a thing, but to basically kiki and talk, right? And that's what we're going to do today. We're just going to relax. We're going to talk. We're going to share some knowledge. But most importantly, we're going to honor the communities that we're talking about today with respect, with care, with attention. So I'm going to let whomever wants to jump in first to introduce themselves, because that's also my custom, is to allow folk to introduce themselves. So whomever wants to dive in first.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for having me, for listening to me, for being open to this conversation. My name is Chris Simé. I am currently based in Brooklyn, New York. In my background as a student, I graduated from Wesleyan University in 2023, where I studied American Studies, Caribbean Studies, and Social Theory. In my scholarly path, I like to focus on ritual practices and understanding how ritual practices outside of the recognizable canon at times serves as political thought and archival and historical archives. So centering community, ancestry, belonging into this void of space. And I enjoyed your introduction, Julia, of honoring the ancestors there too. It reminds me a lot of the commencement video with Maya Angelou I watched recently, where she was like, bring your people with you when you're going into spaces like this. So I'm bringing them with me here too.
Yes, agreed. When Jay, when you had us open with that, I thought about an aunt and uncle that I lost recently, who lived in Memphis, and one of our last conversations was about it really was one of those intergenerational discussions about where we are politically, socially, culturally, and just, valuing how important that is. So I'm excited to join Chris today for our conversation. Everyone, my name is Bianca Wilson, and I am currently faculty in the social welfare department at UC Los Angeles. Prior to that, what I also bring to this conversation is I was a senior researcher, so not a professor, but still at the university at a sexuality and gender law and policy research institute called the Williams Institute. So I was there for 13 years. I've kind of had a interesting in and out career. Would be happy to, talk to folks about, follow up for those interested after the webinar. But trained community psychologist, but have moved in and out of different spaces where I felt my interest in the work carried me and not wanting to kind of be bound to just like a discipline or a kind of department. My areas of work have been on queer sexuality and sexual cultures, but then also very applied work on LGBT public policy and particularly how that relates to queer youth and LGBTQ folks of color. I also, come to all of this as a Black biracial identified dyke femme who's done work both in community and, brought that to bear in my research. So just happy to join the conversation today.
Zoom always humbles me.
We think we know how this works, and we're like, wait a minute.
It says, no, you don't. Go sit down, little girl. So I was going to say thank you to Chris. Thank you, Bianca, for just showing up already in the space. I know it's Zoom, and Zoom tends to flatten us out, but believe me when I tell you, one could feel the wonderful energy of you both. As I mentioned, we will spend about 40 minutes in conversation. I do have questions prepared, but we need not dwell on those because you all are bringing your expertise, your lived experience. What a lovely, quote unquote, intersectional feminist space that we're having here, right? Where we're bringing all of this together. So I'll start with the first question, but take it wherever you all feel the desire to go, right? What responsibilities do institutions such as universities like Wake Forest, government, and nonprofit organizations have in addressing inequities faced by LGBTQ plus youth of color, and where have they fallen short historically or in the present? What is the responsibility of institutions?
I mean, there's so many ways to go into it. I mean, name the institution and name how they do or don't serve. I mean, probably don't serve. Um, I think I wanted to start and say, I think for those who try to tackle queer people of color in their sphere, I think there's a dissonance between like inclusion and bringing them in and repair and safety. But I do think also that's a step ahead also sometimes of where the baseline largely is currently. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you think, Bianca.
Yeah, I mean, so a word that you just used, you said when if they are trying, I think that's where I'm actually struggling, even with kind
Mm,
of thinking about the question, like where do they fall short? Well, stuff like the diversity of entities in all those systems in government, say across state governments or different federal administrations, and
yeah,
then the diversity of like different universities, I'm like, fall short. Some are not falling short at all because they're intentionally harming. It's that intention part that you mentioned that really stands out for me, but it's forcing me to first acknowledge that we have a range of intentions that have existed. I mean, I was thinking about like, I don't know, just the moments of hopefulness and appreciation where there's this moment and, not at all, I was not at all buying into the idea that like federal government work was going to save us all. But there were moments in the Biden administration in particular where you actually saw protections for queer youth of color in foster care, in juvenile like criminalization systems, like the areas where I was doing research, like named in
yeah,
executive orders, right? And like aiming to protect and naming it isn't enough, but just that there was this intention and then that you could turn around and have, and so there we could have a conversation about where were they falling short? Was it enough? What else needed to be done? But then you turn around and the intention is to do the opposite, is to remove all investment in that and go full speed ahead. I don't know. So like,
I think you're spot on. I think on one hand, even back to this conversation of democracy and justice and the way that queer people of color fall into this larger conversation. I think when it is even tackled, I think it's under a framework of thinking that is also very limiting and constraining for queer people of color and the way we show up in civic spaces. I forgot who coined like homo nationalism, but I think of that so often, this idea so often, it's like who deserves human rights or like in what way are queer people who are recognized and afforded certain protections and liberties also asked or attempt to, I think, abide by like normative systems and emulate normative lives. And I think what I see mostly in the queer communities I'm part of and amongst other queer people of color is that their lives are very different. Their lives are fundamentally, to be queer is to demand another thing.
So, my next question for you all is what narratives about LGBTQ plus youth of color and LGBTQ plus populations in general have been overlooked or misrepresented? And how can these narratives be reclaimed or amplified? Or, if in fact, do we need new narratives?
In this moment, like political and social moment, it has definitely led me to want to think about reviving the narratives of
Mhm.
queer creativity and survival before these decades of progression. Like there's, speaking as a Gen Xer and kind of sandwiched between both millennials and older, boomers, older folks than me, despite multiple setbacks, despite seeing like the structural investment in white supremacy and capitalism, despite those things, saw various evidence of some movement. And I think for many of us, like feeling jarred by what it means to see such a extreme backslide,
Mm.
and openly discussed backslide, like intentional backslide that is openly discussed. And for me, when I think of like narratives, it's reviving and going back to, and I've been trying to think about like what is the work of our folks that were doing work in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, early 70s, before this progression that can remind us that this work does not stop our survival, our thriving does not stop, even when faced with fewer legal protections, more hostile social narratives. So I don't know. I don't know if that's where you're going. Feel free to jump into somewhere different, Chris, altogether, or like pull from that.
I really enjoy that because I mean, when we ask ourselves like, is there a need for a new narrative? I'm like, I don't trust anyone to tell a new narrative. Like, who's gonna tell it? And I don't think any single person or any single narrative does justice to the complexity of queer Black life, queer life of color. Um, but I do think that it's both a work of unearthing things that are intentionally buried, hidden, surrounded, censored, and also making way for visibility and voice in spaces that, when we're talking about these large systems and institutions that tell these narratives, they're one noted. And if we're really being honest about the like narrative theme that they continue to tell that like predicates all of this like legal and institutional backlash, it's like all the same tropes of the like alien, the other, the monster, the contaminated, that must be destroyed. I think it's always in this oppositional force. This is the narrative that gets constructed. And what we've been getting to is like, I think, so much survival, so much of what queer people of color are trying to do in the conversation of democracy and justice is merely survive. And I think the narrative that we call for must call for something out bigger than survival of queer life, queer love, queer resistance, queer faith, much more compelling.
Chris, do you think we've been talking about that and enough? Like, so if we kind of think of external versus our internal narratives, do you think are talking about our thriving and creativity and spirit enough.
I believe so. I also come from a school of thought that's a little bit like more transnational, and I think that like being a queer person of color isn't only something in the United States and the American culture.
Mhm.
I think myself, I consider myself super Caribbean. Combining the two, I'm a very faithful person, religious person, and in my spiritual practices, I think people of color hold a very reverent space in political environments that are abject to them. So I think it is there, but I think there's also in my Caribbean thought too, there's a form of like marriage that we also practice in our own right. Not to glorify it either, but I think that we understand we are oftentimes in mixed company when we tell stories and we share space. But I do think, and in my life, I've been in spaces where stories are told, where moments of inspiration, moments of life, moments of hope. But I do think they're intentionally disguised for the same reason that I think it depends who the audience is. I think queer people of color and the existing systems, no matter what story we tell, I think if the prevailing theme is also that otherness, it doesn't matter how it'll be received. So I think who's the narrative for also is a big part of like, do we need a new narrative? For who's writing the narrative, who's receiving the narrative? I don't know. I think I feel free by the narratives that I share with those I love.
Yeah, so yeah, that really makes me think like, who's the narrative for? So on one hand, I'm thinking of narratives like individually in community, but then I think how I contribute to narratives as a researcher and how what I publish and what I do, what I put out in terms of my writing on empirical work or theorization about the empirical work. I'm in a place where I'm wondering, am I clear? Not that I want to limit what I report
Yeah.
to create narrative, but just being clear about how is this narrative, how are these data, how are these stories serving and that looks different in this moment. Like years ago, when almost all my work was focused on LGBT youth of color in particular, experiencing this disparity and this disparity, that was really needed because the visibility of harm might actually impact change. And we saw also evidence of how that could get used to
Mhm.
help like allocate resources. So now I'm wondering who might read it and understand that externally. Because
Yeah.
if harm is the purpose, how is me demonstrating that harm is being done helpful? And on one hand, we probably still need like knowledge documented.
Yeah.
On the other hand, like, I don't know, what am I moving forward if that's what they want to see happen?
I think it's a good one too because it's like again deserves to be documented, it deserves to see light, deserves to see justice too. But I think if the goal is repair, if the goal is safety, why does it require narratives of harm for others to empathize? I mean, that's beyond your work. And not a critique of your work at all. I
No, no.
think that's a call to those listening to us too. It's like, okay, what's that appetite about?
And how does democracy thrive on that appetite?
Mm,
Right? How are these narratives part of how we consume the other? Because they do play a role in democratic practices, whether it's to create a victim or to create an enemy. And even how the narratives could be consumed by people who could imagine themselves to be part of the community.
mhm.
Right? How, for example, do you see certain things posted on Instagram by some members of the community are like, well, why are you causing harm to get a like?
Mhm.
Right. So I think these are important questions to ask that you all are posing, right? And I love that you are asking who are the narratives for, because that brings us to a deeper conversation, moments of hopefulness. And I like how you all talked about queer creativity and survival, right? And I think as I'm having the privilege of watching you two go back and forth, I am seeing that queer creativity. So how do we begin to really harness that creativity that might move us beyond pornographic desire to consume harm?
I mean, I love the nod to Audre Lorde in the pornographic.
You know, I always have to bring the Lord in, right?
And I think in that conversation, like the opposite is the erotic. But again, like, yes, that's a super important part for self preservation and community preservation on the individual and the community scale for those who are looking for agency on their own terms, desire, fulfillment on their own terms. Okay, I keep thinking of myself in nightlife because I think nightlife is such a civic space in Brooklyn. And it's like when you create these spaces and then you invite people outside of these communities and they come into these spaces, there's still voyeurism there. And we have to ask the intention of who's consuming the narrative again and for what purpose too. Because I think when outside, I think both are important, like the quantifiable narratives that we tell in research and also supporting the arts and supporting aesthetics and supporting the way that culture tells our story. And we also see that commodified away from us. Also, the exploitation of narratives of queer people of color by people outside of that community for their own, again, back to your point, notoriety, wealth, production, reproduction without credit.
I'm just gonna put this out there. It's interesting for me as someone who I know I initially brought up the idea of creativity because I think of myself as just, in community, enjoying music, art, sports,
Yeah.
talking to folks. But in my work in community, it just doesn't get much nerdier than just it's like data reports, finding ways to not compartmentalize that completely, but also make space for both. I don't know, so just putting that out there that as much as I think of the value personally, creativity and that part of community, know that I'm not part of creating it.
I think it's also completely justified to have that for yourself. Like I don't think we owe it all to the public. Like I don't like all of our knowledge, all of the ways that we see, feel, understand. And then we also have to be clear around, I mean, the philosophy of understanding and the systems, and again, those institutions that we're talking about, and what forms of understanding and knowing are legible and impactful in the arenas that we step into, and which they don't recognize or are not, or also not meant to be legible to them. You don't have to give your art to them either.
True.
We can hold on to things. As I oftentimes tell my students, which for me is a form of resistance, not everything needs to be consumed.
Mm,
When we are living in a structure that oftentimes demands consumption to
mm,
prove validity and worthiness, right? We can get lost a little bit thinking everything we do is for consumption. So Chris, for example, your spirituality doesn't need to be consumed by anybody else for it to be valid,
yeah,
right? And for it to be liberatory for you.
yeah.
And I am a big fan, as a Black woman, particularly in the academy, of not giving everything. Some things really just for me, right? So there are times when I write words that will never be shared with anybody else. I was recently asked if I'm collecting my papers for when I die, and I'm like, no, I don't want to be consumed that way. Other people are fine with it, and I respect that. But I just personally don't want to be consumed that way. Coming back to the conversation at hand, right? I really am enjoying how you all are thinking through this notion of belonging, even though we might not necessarily have used that term. And I kind of sort of want to get to how this notion of belonging vis-a-vis democracy and justice uniquely impact LGBTQ plus youth of color today and across their life cycles, right? From like birth to death, if we could imagine that. In what ways do these systems and systemic oppressions influence life cycles? What gets lost? What gets given? What gets taken? Not taken by oppression, but taken by the people living within these systems, right? So what are they laying claim to, for example? And Chris, you kind of sort of mentioned that a little bit of creating space that is unique, which made me think about Audre Lorde and her kind of talking about space making as a liberatory practice. And that's something that is taken, right? I also thought of like the work of Gloria Anzaldúa, kind of sort of the theory of the flesh and how we take things by bringing knowledge that is oftentimes not valued in the academy. So let's think a little bit about how these systems are impacting, uniquely impacting this community across the life cycle.
As much as we need to be talking about all the ranges of knowledge, kind of this tension between knowing that certain kinds of empirical knowledge are valued more, but at the same time, the communities I work with are not valued more. And so why I still emphasize that one area of knowledge is just, in the wheel, the multiple spokes where I see myself in contributing to justice work, contributing to change. It is in that data, it is in that knowledge production realm, but identifying ways to do that critically and do that in the interest of communities that are not valued. This is very not Audre Lorde in terms of like the tools. I am 100% leaning into many of the tools, even if attempting to do it more critically. And I think we need to talk about that, like as part of the full realm of ways that we contribute to change and still seeing. I mean, I mentioned earlier kind of struggling with, well, what is the narrative that's useful now, but still knowing that there has been some significance and, like, say, just the meaningfulness of saying to queer movement work as a whole that has felt more white and monosexually dominated and cis dominated, saying that, hey, regardless, at this point, even with marriage equality, as significant as that might be from like a social and cultural standpoint, it has not stopped us from having disproportionately more queer youth of color, in particular, in foster care. Hasn't stopped that. Hasn't stopped more queer people of color, particularly trans women and cis women, at much higher rates imprisoned, still experiencing higher rates of poverty. Like we need to enter that into our discussions about what does queer advocacy for justice look like, and you have folks who are doing that work. I'm part of a LGBT anti-poverty network of folks at many of the advocacy groups like NCLR, National Center for Lesbian Rights, and multiple other groups, that are trying to keep reminding like queer movement work that what are folks of color in particular dealing with it. That this is part of queer agenda work and that we need kind of that data and narrative development and creativity to bring to bear to figure out solutions and not let some of our communities get left behind.
No, I'm sitting with the marriage equality invocation too as like this like reoccurring like hallmark moment of also like political accomplishment for some and also attack for others. But then I'm thinking about the work of democracy related to queer people of color. And I think a lot of these hallmark moments are moments that like are about negotiating power within society. But I think the call rather or the need is protection within society. Um, I think that's where I have trouble, and I understand that I feel a dissonance because I think that very limited social protection is there, as far as I understand it. And I'm not married. There's so many more protections that I would want from my governments and institutions that I'm a part of than legal recognition of marriage. I don't know. I'm sure that's important to some. I don't want to discount that, but
Well, yeah, no. I mean, what I could say is a married parent, a mother of three, there's real protections. There's real things.
yeah,
But yet, data would still show, just like marriage didn't save Black folks' economic well-being,
yeah,
it didn't save queer people's economic well-being, not those who were already vulnerable. So, you know, growing up poor for me, like what that would have meant for my mom marriage is not the same thing. It's not the same social protection and kind of saving moment as it is for me as someone who's now middle class. So, socioeconomically. So I think it is a both and it's not about just which that is part of the narrative. That's part of the narrative that many of us are struggling to address. It's not enough to say, did it help some? It's, is it enough for the whole? And the latter answer is no. And so just because it's not enough doesn't mean it was never useful, but
yeah,
we're kind of back in that same place now with,
yeah,
again, anti-queer, intentionally anti-queer administration, like
yeah,
explicitly so. We're starting to see again the like, okay, they're going to find a way to get around. And it does look like there's evidence that they have establishing Supreme Court decisions will allow them to get around the protections for
yeah,
that were afforded with the Obergefell, with the marriage equality. Yet, like you said, that distance that you talked about, that's real because you also acknowledge that not everyone is protected by that, even if some are.
yeah. I think it also, I really do appreciate that perspective too, because I think it adds that family component that I'm not bringing to this conversation too. So thank you. And I think it also helps me further articulate how like these disparities, to think about the long life cycle of queer lives are compound. And I think when we talk about interventions at very specific points in or assigning liberties or protections or powers, you don't consider how so many different forms of discrimination, oppression, disparities have compounded to that point. It's not exclusive to queer people of color, but I think there's additional, I think, layers to that too. I think we think about educational institutions, healthcare institutions, we think about economic systems. These are all systems that compound over time to put queer people of color in disparaging positions at times. So like, where's the intervention? I don't know. Okay, not ideating.
And it's okay that you do.
Mm-hmm.
Perfectly fine. You keep coming to that edge and I'm not gonna go there. I don't know. I mean, you all have me forgetting that there's space and distance between us because I found myself like leaning in, like I was trying to get into the computer to be like in the space, right? I'm like, girl, you can't get any closer. But I really truly appreciate, this whole conversation of protection within society and what that looks like and what is required across a lifespan. I love that you two brought two different perspectives, right? Of yes, I am part of a family and a unit, and I see what marriage does, and then this question of who might get left out of marriage, and why is it that marriage is oftentimes touted as the great equalizer when Bianca, as you talked about, there are all these queer kids of color in I can't get my words out. My brain is moving so fast.
Okay, Mr. Care. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and foster care, right? Would you like to share a little bit more about that? What you've learned over the years about those experiences, please, if you're so inclined.
Yeah, I mean, I'll admit my work, has been more in the intervention of making visible and not necessarily like qualitative stories. So, the work that I've done that brings us to this is demonstrating that, hey, queer youth, and this work now is like 12 years old, but we've seen multiple other studies in other cities keep replicating it, that queer youth are overrepresented in our child welfare system and foster care, and incarcerated. And, what's important to remember about that is often still to this day, like I'll say that if I just say LGBTQ youth or queer youth, for a lot of people, they're not also thinking Black and Brown and Native youth. And that is actually still who we're talking about because they are also overall overrepresented in those same systems. And this is really like a both and, kind of intersectional social statuses. And so, they continue to be overrepresented. It doesn't mean that's all of our stories. It's not, the end all. There's so much more. And it doesn't mean that even youth who are in, who are system involved, it doesn't mean that that's all their story either. They have their own narratives of resilience, resistance, and managing trauma in both difficult but also creative ways. So, nonetheless, that's something we have to continue addressing. And I think trying to understand how do multiple marginalized social statuses matter in producing those rates. And it's not likely as straightforward as, what some folks try to assert.
I love that you bring the complexity of the issue to the table because oftentimes when we're thinking about policy, we like to make a policy issue be very simple. The one thing that I've heard both of you kind of consistently kind of reference is the complexity of being in this society as a whole and how society responds to particular kind of identity markers, right? And so I do appreciate that you all have not tried to simplify this conversation because I think there's danger in oversimplification, right? And I love, Chris, that you talked about staying in the gray, right? Also, when we think about policy and democracy, we're oftentimes looking for absolutes, which sometimes gets us to these places that you all have so beautifully discussed. And so, what can the gray give us? Right? What are the possibilities within the gray when we move away from the absolutes? So we are coming up on time. They aren't real. I don't see any questions, but I invite our audience to write any questions they have in the chat or the Q&A. But I also want to give you all a moment to say what's on your heart that you would like our audience to think critically about. If you could offer one or two things that we did not even begin to touch on, and I know we cannot do this justice in 50 minutes. We really can. We need multiple conversations. So hopefully this is a start for some of our audience members, or it's an invitation for those who are thinking very critically about these issues to come into the gray space, right? So if there's one thing on your heart that you would like our audience to think critically about, what might that be?
Um, I mean, for me, it's a question. What is on my heart is a question with a whole bunch of layers, and it's kind of bringing us back to where Chris is like kind of bringing us a couple times to thinking forward. What are solutions? How do we move ahead? And what has been on my heart is how can we be both strategic but also not leave folks behind? I mean, in organizing, in electoral politics, I don't know. I think of things, again, just to be concrete, I think of things like critiques of Kamala Harris during her campaign and folks saying, okay, she wasn't verbally like supportive enough of trans youth, and seeing like the attacks on trans youth. And yet, I think us full scale knowing, okay, out of the two, and even her own record, don't you think she's probably going to be more supportive? Not just more, but like has demonstrated some support, but even that's complicated. But the conversation that comes up in that is, was that strategic to not say more that needed to be said, but in not saying more, was she leaving folks behind? And and I don't have the answer to that. I mean, I'm not confident had she said more that would have won it. Some people have argued that. Um, I'm not confident about that at all. But yeah, I think that's a real important question. And this especially comes up when we're talking about queer youth of color. Like when you see folks of color in general and trans people in particular being so deeply under attack, and so explicitly, how are we strategic about what it means to create platforms at the most local to federal levels that are successful and inclusive, but don't ignore some rights, but also are strategic. Like I don't have the answer. I haven't seen anyone discuss the answer in ways that make sense to me, but I feel like that is, you know, that is on my heart. There's too big of a risk to not being strategic as well. Sorry, Chris, I know we're at time. Go, please go.
No, oh, this is beautiful. Good. We're not rushed. We're
I'll say there's so many things on my heart. So I think constant theme for me, I guess, in this session is like parse out the message that serves you, those listening. In a lot of sense, this is like reflective of like a world building project that we're in. And I think that the stories that we are told and the stories that we believe either reify or deconstruct or reconstruct the worlds, our interior worlds, the worlds and the communities we lived in, our whole exosphere. So I encourage you to question. I think that like, what is the fear? What is the horror? What is that underlying narrative that continues to replicate so much harm? Why? Like, where? What's a threat? Like, what is the real threat? Who's scared of what? I think that disarms this machine, at least in the individual sense, and it gives you a real point of view. This state, whether this world making project can be transformed or not, there are possibilities for making other worlds. So I don't like to fall into this. I think we are all also in the individual, but more importantly in the collective, capable of world making and world, I don't like world changing, but world making. And also like world destroying. I like the idea of world destroying, like blow it all up. But again, also like ask yourself, who do you trust to tell the narrative? Like I don't think it's one person's job either. Like I don't trust one single person with creating a world for me to live in. I don't know. So exercise your own agency too and protect the agencies of others and protect that.
Hmm. Wow. Okay, you all are preaching. We do have one question, if you all are up to it.
Yeah.
The question is, we exist in a time where social media and digital spaces shape much of social discourse. Do you see these platforms as helpful or a hindrance to activism and organizing?
I think there's room for it to be both. Like, I genuinely do think that social media has been so pivotal to activism and to movement making in the last few years. I think it globalizes a lot of these conversations in helpful ways too, but I think we also run into a lot of pitfalls. We run into a lot of harm there too. Um, we run into suspicious intentions in terms of how people engage in social media discourse as activism, as performance, as I find myself very active on social media sometimes too, and so I think it's a useful, very useful space for discourse. I think we also have to be critical too of again, like what stories, what narratives do we deem true? What do we take in? I think that also part of my urgency too. I think we also exist in a very anti-intellectual world. So don't believe everything that you see on the internet and also passes for so-called activism too.
I agree with Chris, like in terms of it being a both and just thinking about this distinction between, say, mobilizing and information sharing versus community building and growth through dialogue. And the latter, I'm not confident social media platforms do well in terms of community building, in terms of back and forth, authentic engagement and really opportunities for growth and like hearing each other out. If we're going to find ways to mobilize across some differences, because we have to, we fundamentally have to. And I don't see enough evidence of that going very well online. And yet, like as a venue for, Chris, as you said it, like thinking broader beyond the states and, incorporating like global perspective and getting information and mobilizing. Like once someone has a plan and letting others know that they can engage, participate, it just seems like it's been such an important catalyst for a number of folks across generations actually to feel more engaged and aware. So I don't know, it's a both and. I mean, I think we saw a lot of folks like in 2024 trying to find like talking more explicitly about these ways of how do we try to use social media to get us then in person together.
What a wonderful conversation. And, as a social scientist, yes, I love data, but I also love the murkiness of life. And as Bianca, you so beautifully said, both and as opposed to either or. I think it's the either or thinking that sometimes puts us in boxes. And can somewhat be limiting. So I think, there's lots of stuff for us to take away from this conversation. For me, I'm taking away the both and the gray space, right? So how could I be both and in that gray space as we continue to think about liberation and about freedom, and not just for one community, but for all oppressed communities, right? Which brings me back as we close to the Combahee River Collective, which talks about freedom for all people, queer folk, non-queer folk, but for all of us, how do we get to a place of liberation where, for me, that means we're living our best possible lives without the interference of oppressive structures. Maybe I'm idealistic, I don't know. But I would love to think that someday we're going to get there. And you all have, in your conversation around complexity, believe it or not, given me hope because we could see how to think through these issues without flattening them out, right? And I think that's how we begin to engage in world making, and not flattening out the complexities of life, but truly grappling with them. And for me, as I sat here and I watch you too, I delighted in how you all grappled and thought through. So I was glad you didn't have prepared stuff because there was something that was so authentic and beautiful with the grappling, right? Which is what we so need in a society that tends to have everything concluded. So, a very convoluted way of saying thank you for allowing us to be in your inner thoughts for these few moments as we really think about LGBTQ plus youth of color, democracy, and freedom. So, on behalf of WGSS at Wake Forest, I thank you both. Take care.